Hi everyone, I'm Brian Pellet. I'm the founding director of Taboom Media, and today, as part of this SSOGIE series video, we're sitting down with journalist and filmmaker Collison. So Carl, we first met in 2017 when you were a journalist with the Mail and Guardian, and at the time you were reporting on queer issues for them. What got you into this beat? Why did you start reporting on LGBTQI issues?
So it kind of happened accidentally, actually, or by chance, because the MNG had a position for a queer reporter, or someone to cover queer issues across the continent. So I applied for this position, and and I got it, and it was a perfect fit in a way, because before that I'd been writing human interest stories. So this opportunity kind of gave me an opportunity to meld that interest for human interest stories with queer activism.
Okay, and what did you learn? You were reporting there for a few years, right?
Yeah.
What did you learn along the way in covering this very sensitive beat?
I think one of the big takeaways for me is that if you're reporting on something that doesn't get much airtime in traditional media, there's always a story. You know, it's like an onion. You always peel one layer back.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's another fascinating story, another fascinating aspect to this beat. So yeah, there's always a story. That was a big thing. And then also, I think that just people who are underrepresented just love being heard and seen and respected. Those were big takeaways for me.
What were some of the stories that really stuck with you after reporting there?
I think the first big story that really stuck with me was the story of trans women who are forced to go to initiation schools. So in Xhosa culture, in order to be seen as a man, if you're a boy, you have to go to initiation schools, this process. And of course, these trans women view that they're women, but the community doesn't see them as women. The community sees them as young boys who need to go and become men. So it was very interesting, that kind of tension and collision between culture and this traditional culture and gender expression, and just the kind of doors that opened in terms of, for me as a reporter, that I found it very interesting.
And I'm sure along the way you must have learned interesting tricks and techniques to really get people to come out of their shells, and also just to make sure you were reporting these stories in ways that are safe for the sources. So what sort of safety tips did you learn, and do you have for other journalists reporting on this feed?
I think the big thing is to bend over backwards to secure the safety of your sources. Like, there are times when you'd interview people and they'd know exactly the publication you're writing for, they know the kind of reach the publication has, and they will say, yes, you can include my name, you can, I'm fine with being identified. But then you have to think, no, wait, there will actually be some fallout for this person. So there have been times when I've actually said to people, I don't think we should include your name in the story. I don't think we should include this bit in the story, just because of the potential. Yeah, you just have to bend over backwards to keep your sources safe.
And it's that idea of informed consent, right?
Yeah.
With journalists, when you stick a microphone in someone's face, that's kind of generally considered consent. But when we work on sensitive issues, you really want to let them know the stakes.
Completely. The stakes are high for a lot of people, especially across the continent.
And then what might you do if you decide not to use their name? Like, what techniques could you use?
Not identifying the city that they live in, the area that they live in. When you're photographing them, nothing that's, if for example a source has yellow nail polish and that's her signature in the community where she lives, to not photograph that yellow nail polish, or just to go completely out of your way to not reveal as much of that person's identity as possible.
And you can use pseudonyms.
Yes,
and that
exactly,
kind of thing too.
exactly.
And in this reporting, I mean, it's a sensitive topic. There's a lot of homophobia, queerphobia in newsrooms, in our communities. Have you encountered that kind of backlash from your colleagues or from community, family, those sorts of things? And how have you been able to overcome that, to actually get these stories out?
I never had backlash in terms of colleagues or in the newsroom, I can't say. I've been fortunate in that way. But there has been, I've had one death threat, which was not a pleasant thing to go through. But I had a lot of support from the newsroom. In terms of, the funny thing is, I've had a lot of pushback from within the queer community. When I came on board, when I started reporting, I had lesbian women and trans women saying that I can't write their stories. I'm not allowed to. They found it very problematic that a cisgendered male, queer as I may be, is writing their stories. And that took a long while for me to process. I'm like, am I really the person to do this? But I had a job to do, and then I think, fortunately, I managed to kind of get them on my side in a way, to show them, like, I am doing this as respectfully as I can with my limited tools. But that was most of the backlash. And then in terms of, we had also, I remember the readers we had a comment section, below each story online there's a comment section. We had really vile comments, like really very conservative, hateful comments, to the point where the online editor decided to turn off the comments for my stories. So that was, then again, I had the support of the paper, the publication, which was great. I mean, that went a long way. Otherwise, I would be really sad doing that job,
Well, one thing, you mentioned backlash from the queer community, and one thing I always think you do so well in your reporting is giving the voice to people. So much of your story is direct quotes from sources, which I think is such a great technique and a great way to make sure you're letting people's voices come through. But in terms of your own safety with the death threats, what have you done to protect your own safety in reporting on this topic?
To be honest, my own safety is not so, the safety of my sources is more important. When I traveled, for example, to Uganda or Tunisia, then I would do things like remove social media apps from my phone and deactivate my social media accounts, Once in Tunisia, I was stopped by cops, and they have a habit of searching your phone, and just dragging you and arresting you. So, and they took my phone, and fortunately I had my social media apps off the phone. So that made me feel a bit safer. It was a bit of a tussle getting my phone back, but eventually I did, and I did feel safer having taken that kind of extra precaution, But like I said, I'm more concerned generally about the safety of my sources than my own.
But often we walk around with big cameras, journalists have all this equipment, so you are sort of a target. People can see, police officers can see. So also just the idea of once you do an interview, take the SIM card out, put it somewhere else.
I would immediately send the recording, email the audio recording, any video footage, any images, email it as soon as possible to myself so that it's in my inbox, and you can take my phone, but I can access that anyway.
So you do such good reporting on this topic, but for a lot of people, for personal beliefs, religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, they don't really want to touch reporting on gender and sexual diversity. What advice would you have if that's the case for a journalist who's maybe been assigned a story by an editor but thinks that they won't be able to do a good job because of whatever biases they may have?
My advice would then be leave journalism. You can't let your beliefs interfere with your job. Your job is to tell the story, and tell it fairly and objectively, or as objectively as possible. Other than that, if you really feel that you can't do it, don't do it. Rather don't report on it than do harm.
And that's, even if people have good intentions, often they can do harm by not realizing the gravity of reporting on this topic and the need for safety and sensitivity. There's a lot of stories of trauma that come up just by the nature of the topic, which can really weigh on you and sit with you What advice do you have for people, journalists, who day in and day out face a lot of trauma in their reporting and it starts affecting their own mental health?
Develop a drinking habit. I think therapy, I can say, is, for me, has saved my life, literally saved my life. I had a bit of a mini breakdown. I did a series of stories, and I was looking into the violence that women went through during the armed struggle, and it really pushed me over the edge. And I had to run to the nearest therapist. And I think since then I can see the value of debriefing with someone, even if it isn't a therapist per se, just having someone to talk to and say like, yo, I did this terrible story, or I did this very harrowing story, like I don't know how to process it, or I think just the value of speaking to someone, or speaking, because I think as journalists, within the newsroom, it's a kind of, it's that hangover, that machismo hangover, of like, just buck up and do it, like at M&G, certainly we didn't have any therapy. We weren't given any form of therapy or offered any form of therapy. So yeah, I think just speaking about it, speaking about your trauma is healing in itself,
And there are resources and organizations for journalists who face trauma, some of which we can link to in the video link below this so people know, but those exist, and it's important that people know how to access those sources. So also sometimes you face hate speech from sources. It's just part of the nature of this. When you're interviewing a homophobic pastor or government leader, how have you addressed that in your reporting? What have you done when someone says something that's just beyond the pale, maybe even dangerous hate speech? What do you do with that information?
I try not to include it as far as possible, unless it's absolutely necessary. There are, and I think when it is included, one needs to be especially mindful of how it is handled by the sub-editors and the editors. People who are responsible for headlines and blurbs on your stories, because they could take that particular bit of hate speech out of your story, which you might have crafted with the best of intentions, and use it for, to sell a paper. Sensationalize it, basically. There was an example of the Mark Timothy Frick with one of our newspapers here, that inflammatory headline.
Just if you can give us a sense of what that means in English.
Yeah, sorry. So it means basically kill the faggot. And it was, they were covering the murder of David Olaine, a very brutal murder that happened in the Western Cape. And this was apparently what the murderer had said just before murdering David Olaine. Was kill the faggot in Afrikaans, Mark Timothy Frick. And then this newspaper, The Voice, ran with this as their barker. They barked on the posters and headlines, and it was just terrible because it's so triggering for a lot of people, and it potentially legitimizes that kind of language, seeing it in print. And so, yeah, we have to be really careful when including hate speech in our, or potentially damaging or hurtful quotes or whatever in our copy. We just have to be careful how it is handled.
That's obviously a terrible example, but the word mofi in isolation, the word queer in isolation, like some of these terms have been reclaimed. But some of our audiences don't necessarily know that.
No.
So how do you personally go about using the word queer in a story if it comes up? Do you use the word queer? Do you contextualize it?
I use the word queer all the time. I remember when I first started reporting on queer issues, we got a few letters saying from conservatives, but liberal conservatives in a way, we're down with queers, but why are you calling them queers? That's offensive. But we were like, no, it's a political, it's political motivation for calling people queer. It's now seen as an accepted umbrella term, for everybody that's LGBTIQ plus. So, I don't see it as an offensive word. Morphe I do find is slightly a bit less easy to work with. I wouldn't easily use that word in my copy unless it's a direct quote from someone, because the word still carries a lot of violence. It's not as accepted and embraced and reclaimed as queer.
Yeah, there's a difference between words communities use, like in-group words that people use in a safe environment, and words that journalists are using to describe communities.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
I wanted to ask you, I watched these amazing videos that you produced, I think it was in 2020, the series In My Own Voice, about queer life in Tunisia, Ghana, Uganda, South Africa. Just tell us a bit about this series and what you hope to accomplish with it.
So it kind of happened, it kind of happened by chance in a way, even though I'd worked so long on it. But yeah, the idea wasn't for it to start, from the start the idea wasn't to have a series, it was just to have these like individual kind of short films that took a really intimate look into different queer experiences across the continent, or in various parts of the continent. And a very important thing was to have, that's why it's called In My Own Voice, is to have people speak without me interfering. So it's literally in their own voice. That was just the idea, I think, to offer a kind of, microscope into the intimate lives of someone, the inner world of someone who's queer. Because I find that a lot of the times when we write about queer people or anybody, we write from this position, and there's also something so powerful about hearing someone's actual voice, and no matter how well you write a story, you can't communicate someone's voice, because there's a tenderness, there's a sincerity that only the voice can communicate. So that was kind of the idea behind it.
I think being a queer journalist, part of a community, you're sort of more aware of the words, you're more aware of some of the issues people face just through your day-to-day life. But can non-queer journalists cover this community and do a good job?
Yes, I think so. Yes, I do think so. I prefer to have more women, queer women, and trans women, and in newsrooms. That would be amazing for me, like non-binary folk. Like, can we just un-cisgender the newsroom, de-cisgender the newsroom? That would be amazing. So there is still a lack of gender diversity in the newsrooms generally. But yes, of course, like queer people, straight people can cover queer issues, but if I had to employ people, if I had my own publication, queer people first, right? But yes, of course, you just have to be anybody really, no matter if you're queer or not, you just have to be sincere and want to do it, what you're doing for the greater good, of everyone. So I think then, it doesn't matter who's reporting on it.
Absolutely. All right, thanks so much, Carl. It's always a pleasure to speak to you, and thanks for all your insights.
Pleasure.
Thanks for watching this video in our journalism series, and be sure to watch all of the other videos in the journalism playlist.